Good afternoon. Welcome to session number 11 of the symposium. We're here, oh good, there's Louise, good. And where we have three presentations examining the history of the 20th century at both the local level and the global level. We're going to depart from the previous schedule a little bit because of Katie Wagner has a class right after this one, so we're going to have Katie's presentation first, then Lucas, then Luis, and hi Luis, and we will also depart from a procedure that we often take, and that is this time we'll have each presentation and then have questions or comments following immediately, and then the next, rather than waiting for them all at the end, again, because we want to make sure that Katie can participate fully in the session. Okay, so therefore, Katie is our first presenter. Katie, where are you from? What's your hometown here?
I'm from Goldsboro, North Carolina.
Wilkesboro. Okay, thank you. So Katie Wagner is from Wilkesboro, and she's a high school senior, duly enrolled in the Wayne School of Engineering and Wayne Community College. She'll complete her Associated Science degree this spring and earn the WCC Honors Program Certificate. In addition, she's an active member of the North Carolina Scholars of Global Distinction Program. She's interested in pursuing a higher degree in international studies or political science after graduating from WCC. And I heartily invite you to apply to UNCG, where you could pursue both of those studies. So thank you. Her paper is called Understanding the Events at Mili, How Miscommunication Formed and Followed a Massacre.
So can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Perfect. So I did my paper on the Milan Massacre, which was kind of in tangent with the Vietnam War, also in tangent with the Cold War. And I chose it because it was something I had found out as a list of research paper topics, and it was never actually addressed in the class, which I found really surprising because after I did my personal research, I realized what a monumental event it was. So I learned that, with domino theory and the fear of communism, it led to the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. Is that coming from me?
I'm hearing some noise.
Is that from you?
No, I don't know. I heard.
Okay, so that allowed President Lyndon B. Johnson to justify the United States involvement without consulting other executives. And so though South Vietnam was famous for their brutal, corrupt governing tactics, America was willing to support them against their northern communist counterparts. And so even though the war was between two halves of Vietnam, it was, the United States and Russia, they held the metaphorical strings the entire time. It was also different because this was the first televised war. So both the front line and the home front were connected more so than they normally would have been. So not only casualty reports, but there was live television coverage of some of the conflict, and that gave civilians a lot more insight into what was going on in person in Vietnam. So leading up to the event, American forces, they knew that Vietnam was largely fought against invisible enemies. So booby traps, landmines, sniper fire from South Vietnam's forces, also known as Viet Cong. That was really common among them. It wasn't very head-to-head. And up until that point where the Milan Massacre happened, Charlie Company had suffered a bunch of trap-related casualties. So when they were faced with the opportunity to retaliate, they were definitely enthusiastic about doing that. So on the early morning of March 16th in 1968, I learned that the Task Force Barker, they were airlifted to Sun Mai in Vietnam, and they were greeted by women and children and elderly just tending to their daily lives. And even though they were trained to be cautioned against the VC in disguise, they still went in and just shot people on sight. They fired on entire groups of unarmed civilians, slaughtered livestock, and humans alike, throwing hand grenades into their houses whenever people were unresponsive to being called outside. In addition to that, as if mass murder weren't extreme enough. A bunch of villagers, they were gang raped, mutilated, dismembered. And some of the moral repercussions of this event actually drove a lot of the soldiers in Charlie Company to suicide. So it was really a monumental event. And considering everything that had happened, the fact that hundreds of people, hundreds of innocent villagers had just been murdered, it was not publicized, and it still isn't talked about as much as I believe it should be. One of the lieutenants, this is a key factor that I found in my research. He was actually killed the most number of people single-handedly, including like a monk, a woman kneeling with her hands up, and a 2-year-old toddler coming out of a ditch. And despite all of that, he was the only one who was convicted of anything in the entire conflict. Everyone else, they weren't even charged with accompanying the war crimes. And this entire massacre was only stopped after the helicopter pilot, Officer Thompson, he was scouting the area for enemies, and he noticed the bodies in the ditches piling up and the fires over Mili, and flew down to evacuate any survivors, the very few that were remaining. But the point behind all of this is the fact that all of this happened, and yet the first time I heard of it was when I typed in to a search bar, Milan Massacre, and had to see for myself all of the atrocities of war that had been going on, and I had no idea. And this was actually the same for everybody else in the world, because the truth remained hidden all the way until April 1969, when the investigation was launched after a helicopter gunner had heard from his friends in Charlie Company. So it wasn't even actually any American governmental officials who had heard about it and reported it and publicized it. It was someone who had heard from a friend of a friend. And even though after he had heard, he wrote letters to congressmen, the White House, Senate Department, the Defense Department, compiled photographs from the journalist on site, and even witness testimonies, it was still not properly addressed. I actually have a couple photographs that I would like to share if that's possible. They are a little graphic, but I think that they're necessary in understanding what all has happened. Can you see my screen? Okay. So here's the tactical map that they used, and the newspaper that had finally, the very first announcement to the public that this massacre had happened, with the photographs on the front page, and then there were 2 additional pages of photographs. A quote from one of the civilians who had survived commented on the children that he had to witness get murdered and the parents that weren't there to comfort them. And that really speaks to the horror of the entire event. Here were some of the photographs featured in the newspaper article. The people pictured, they do not have nice clothing. Most of them, all of them, do not have shoes. They're just left to die, and none of them even said, or one of the sergeants on site even said that none of them seemed to be anywhere near of fighting age. So you can see that they were just completely vulnerable to attack, and the forces that marched upon them took full advantage of that. The quote from the journalist who was on site, he says, "Both the killer and killed are victims in Vietnam." And that really explains a lot of the event, because the soldiers who came to the site, they were victims of the fact that they had to deal with what they had done for the rest of their lives, and they had to live with that. So let me pause my sharing. So essentially, the consequences of the Milan Massacre, it prompted a change in the lives of many people and planted doubt in military actions, among others. Lieutenant Calley, he only served a couple years of his lifetime sentence and essentially went free. But beyond the signing blame, preventing another massacre of innocents, I believe, merits far greater attention. As a result of Mili, a bunch of military codes saw change, as well as changes in the ethical and moral standards in the Army. So they instituted the Army ethic that expected soldiers to, act honorably, report illegal, unethical, immoral orders and actions, and treat everyone with respect generally. They instituted the Judge Advocate General Corps, which was created to provide each brigade with multiple lawyers to review all operations. and make sure that there were always multiple perspectives on everything that happened, so that all information was properly disclosed along the chain of command, and nothing such as catastrophic as Mili happened again. They found that American soldiers and their superiors were really forced to make decisions that made the difference between life and death in Mili, but the Army was trusted to communicate with their forces and with the people as efficiently as possible. And we kind of saw that breakdown in the Milan Massacre. So I found that thanks to studying this event that had happened, I really learned the importance of communication and how it really is the key to understanding people, understanding everybody, and how we can all work together. And as I said before, it's not so much as the fact as who was at fault, examining it completely objectively, but it's more so how we can take that, accept that it did happen, but also that we have the power to prevent it from happening again in the future.
Thank you, Katie. I am not entirely positive that Dr. Billenkoff is completely connected to our meeting. Dr. Billenkoff, can you unmute by any chance? It looks like we're having some technical difficulties. So I'll say really quickly, thank you, Katie, very much for your presentation. And let me go ahead and open it up for a few questions. Does anyone have any questions for Katie?
Yeah, you mentioned how a soldier found out about this information by asking a friend. How did they recover the photographs and that material that you presented?
So there was a memoir written by Seymour Hersh. He had the quote that I included at the very end. He personally, he was one of the people that the helicopter pilot had contacted, and then he in turn had to reach out to Lieutenant Callie, who was the one who had been there and done the most in Mili. So it was very much on him, the journalist who went in person to Vietnam, to the site of the massacre, and then again back to Cali. It was very, personal, involved, going around making those connections. And it was a lot of the sources, most of the sources did come from Seymour Hersh.
Okay. Other questions for Katie?
I do have one question for everybody though. How many of you had heard about the massacre?
I feel like you might be speaking to an audience that is already predisposed to know a little bit as people who are interested in historians, but can you say a little bit more about why you were so moved by the sort of lack of general knowledge about this?
Yeah, so honestly, I think it was surprising, kind of ironic that, for being the first televised war, it had so many discrepancies, breaks in communication. And I think that's part of because, a lot of the people, they felt that the Vietnam War was not necessary to have fought, and felt as if they didn't have as much of a say in it as they deserved. I found when I was putting my presentation together, even though it was objectively, describing what had happened in Mili, a lot of people, namely Vietnam veterans, veterans of the Vietnam War, they were not pleased in how I depicted the American forces. And I think that just goes to show the extent to which they wanted to keep what had actually happened covered up, or maybe just prettified,
All right, maybe time for one final question for Katie before we move on. Louise, go ahead.
Can you hear me now? Okay, sorry, I was muted. So you said that you asked if we had heard about that that event before, and they were surprised that not many people had heard about it. My question is, was that addressed anywhere here at UNCG, whatever? I can't remember where you go to. I'm sorry. But was that addressed in a class, or did you hear it from like professors, students, peers?
That's a great question, actually. I think my surprise is mainly because I had such little knowledge of it, but I was in a history class at my own high school, and it was a project topic, and it was just, that was the only mention of it in the entire course, just listed as a potential project topic. And I think the fact that it was only like the Vietnam War itself only took 3 days of the class, so it really wasn't touched on at all.
All right, well, we will say thank you again, Katie, and wish you a very good class. Katie had to go first to meet her, to get to her class this afternoon. So thank you for joining us, and we appreciate your contribution. Looks like Dr. Billenkopf has returned. Dr. Billenkopf, can you unmute and join us again? I feel like the universe is telling us it's tired of Zoom and that we just need to do something else as a way to communicate again. Well, hopefully she'll be able to return. So in the meantime, we'll go ahead and move on to our next speaker, who is Lucas Tucker. So Lucas is a first-year honors student in Lloyd International Honors College at UNCG and studying history. And he enjoys a good bowl of soup on a winter day. That's a wonderful fun fact. So Lucas will be talking to us today about, is it Bertha Sternberger?
Bertha,
did I get that correct?
yes.
All right, so Lucas, please.
Hi, okay, my name is Lucas Tucker. Y'all heard my intro. Let me share my screen for y'all. Where's the present? Okay. There we go, okay. Yeah, so I'm going to talk about Bertha Sternberger. So this is a little before what we just heard from Katie, and it's local in Greensboro. So if you go around Greensboro, you might see the name Sternberger on certain buildings or just signs around the town. So Bertha Sternberger, she came to Greensboro in 1900 to marry into the Sternberger family. Her husband was Edward Sternberger, and the Sternberger and the Cohn families were the two founders of the textile mills that sort of built up Greensboro and put it on the map. So I'm going to talk about Bertha because she is an important woman to Greensboro's history. She is what I would call Greensboro's progressive era reformer. Progressive era reformer just means a woman from the late 1800s to the early 1900s who was a leader in her community, fighting for reform. So examples would be like Ida B. Wells or Margaret Sanger. So Bertha Strauss, she graduated UNCG. She participated in women's organizations. She organized a lot of events. She was big in the fight for the vote in Greensboro. She also had a brief stint with her illness, so she started fighting for disability rights. And she also donated to people of color and to schools for children of color. Her major focus of her reforms was on children and education, though. So that gets into her stamp program. So she was one of the first women on Greensboro School Council, and she wanted playgrounds in Greensboro. So she organized this project to sell these stamps that you can see. They've got little kids on them. This is the best picture I could find. It's very grainy, and I apologize. But she built Greensboro's first playground, and it is now County Park in Greensboro. And it's a little more built up now. They replaced some of the playground equipment with some areas for fishing and that sort of thing. But that was her doing. And she really had to fight for this because not a lot of people wanted playgrounds because they were considered to be a distraction. They were busy, they were loud, people don't like kids. But she really believed that it would be important for the growth of children in Greensboro. So that's what she did. She's kind of cool like that. So I'm going to talk about doing research on local figures. So when you're researching figures that are locally important, it is oftentimes difficult to find sources. So I had to use the Greensboro's newspaper archive, and the newspaper archive that I used was the Greensboro Daily News. So you can see here, there is a selection about Bertha Strauss hosting a lunch party, which I think is very fun. And I actually am going to show you the newspaper clipping that is from. So I used the historical newspaper database, and I searched for Sternberger, and then I specifically looked for a Mrs. Sternberger. She's called Mrs. E. Sternberger because at the time it was, you would go by your husband's name in the news, or if there was any information about you, unless you specifically chose not to. It was a very politicized statement. But Bertha Strauss did go by Mrs. E. Sternberger in newspapers. So that is why it says that here. But yeah, this is a newspaper from 1916. There's some interesting ads on it. I can zoom out. Using local newspapers sources, I thought it was very fun. It's very cool. So yeah, that's how I found that. I'm going back to here. So her lunch party. I also used the Greensboro History Museum Journal, which is where I found sources about her playground and the pictures of the stamps. Oftentimes when we don't have access to archives, we can talk to the history museums that are local to the person we are researching, and that helps us find information that we, as part of the public sector, don't often have access to. So that's a good resource. I also looked at her obituary, which is kind of sad, but she is dead. Obituaries are good because they have a lot of information about what the person did during their life, often the people that lived after them, so you can reach out to those people if need be. And then the other thing that I did to find out about Bertha Strauss was wandering around Greensboro, and this part was